The New Mexico sun hammered down on Samuel McKinnon's shoulders like the fists of an angry god, each ray a punishment for sins both committed and imagined. At 36 years of age, Wolf McKinnon, as the few who knew him had taken to calling him, worked the fence line near Bitter Creek, with movements that spoke of bone-deep weariness. Not the exhaustion that came from honest labor, but the kind that settled into a man's soul when he'd given up on seeing another spring. The fence post wobbled in his grip, loose from where last month's flash flood had softened the earth. He'd been meaning to fix it for weeks now, but somehow the days had bled together into one long stretch of meaningless time. 3 years since the cholera had taken Sarah and little William. 3 years of waking up to an empty house that echoed with ghosts. He couldn't quite bring himself to exercise. Wolf paused in his work, wiping the sweat from his brow, with a sleeve already soaked through. The landscape stretched out before him in waves of ochre and rust, broken only by the stubborn mesquite and greasewood that somehow found purchase in this unforgiving soil. 20 miles to the nearest town, 15 to his closest neighbor, just the way he wanted it, or so he told himself during the long nights when the coyotes sang their lonely songs to an indifferent moon. That's when he saw her. At first, Wolf thought the heat was playing tricks on his eyes. Desert mirages were common enough this time of year when the air shimmered like water over hot stone. But the small figure stumbling across his property was no illusion. A child moving in that peculiar weaving pattern that spoke of exhaustion beyond measure. Wolf set down his tools with careful deliberation, his hand instinctively moving toward the Colt .45 that rode his hip. These were dangerous times in the territory. The Apache had been pushed hard by the army, their traditional lands carved up by settlers and speculators. Raids and counter-raids had painted the desert red with blood from both sides. A child alone could mean a trap, could mean warriors waiting in the draws and arroyos that cut through his land like scars. But something in the way the small figure moved stayed his hand. This wasn't the calculated approach of a decoy. This was desperation made flesh. As he walked toward the child, Wolf kept his movements slow and deliberate, hands visible. The desert had its own language, and sudden movement spoke only of threat. The closer he got, the more his initial wariness transformed into something else, a feeling he'd thought buried with his family. It was a girl no more than 9 summers by his reckoning. Her traditional Apache dress hung in tatters, the intricate beadwork that should have proclaimed her status now dulled with dust and torn by thorns. But it was her face that hit Wolf like a physical blow. The child's dark eyes seemed too large for her face. The skin stretched tight over bones that showed too clearly. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and when she tried to speak, only a rasp emerged. She gestured weakly toward her mouth, then toward the creek that ran through Wolf's property. Even if he'd wanted to turn away, and part of him did the part that knew getting involved meant trouble, he couldn't. Not with those eyes looking at him with a mixture of fear and hope that was achingly familiar. Wolf had seen that look before in another pair of eyes. William's eyes the day the fever had taken hold, and his boy had looked to his father to make everything right again. Wolf had failed then. The memory of it had been eating him alive for 3 years. Without a word, he bent down and scooped the girl into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like holding a bundle of dried sticks wrapped in cloth. She didn't fight him, didn't have the strength for it, even if she'd wanted to. Her body trembled against his chest from fear or hunger or simple exhaustion, he couldn't tell. The walk back to his cabin seemed to take forever, though it couldn't have been more than a few hundred yards. With each step, Wolf felt the weight of his decision settling onto his shoulders. His neighbors would call him a fool. The Apache were the enemy had been since the first white man set foot in this territory. Helping one of their children would be seen as betrayal at best, collaboration at worst. But Wolf had been living as a dead man for 3 years. What did the opinions of the living matter to him now? Inside his cabin, the temperature dropped by degrees, the thick adobe walls providing blessed relief from the sun's assault. Wolf set the girl down gently in his only chair, the one Sarah had brought with them from Missouri, its wood polished smooth by years of use. The child's eyes darted around the sparse interior, taking in the single room with its few furnishings, the rifle propped in the corner, the cooking pot still warm on the stove. Wolf moved with purpose, now ladling leftover venison stew into a bowl. He'd made it last night, adding wild onions and the last of his potatoes. The smell seemed to revive the girl somewhat, and for the first time since he'd spotted her, something that might have been hope flickered across her features. As he turned to hand her the bowl, Wolf's eyes caught on something that made his blood run cold as a mountain stream. Around the girl's neck, partially hidden by her torn dress, hung a necklace of intricate beadwork. The pattern was distinctive, alternating rows of turquoise and white, with a central medallion of carved bone. Tom Weatherby had described that exact necklace to him not 5 days ago when they'd met at the crossroads to trade news. It was the ceremonial jewelry of Chief Red Sky's family, worn only by those of his direct bloodline. Chief Red Sky, whose very name could make hardened soldiers check their weapons and whisper prayers to whatever god they favored. Wolf's hand froze halfway to giving her the bowl. If this child was who he thought she was, he wasn't just harboring an Apache girl. He was holding the daughter of the most feared war chief in 3 territories, a man whose reputation for swift and terrible vengeance was the stuff of campfire nightmares. But the girl was already reaching for the food, with hands that shook like autumn leaves, and Wolf found he couldn't pull it back. Whatever came next, he couldn't let a child starve. Not again. Never again. He watched her eat with the focused intensity of true hunger, taking small bites and chewing carefully, despite her obvious desperation. There was a dignity to her movements that spoke of careful teaching of manners drilled into her, even in extremity. This was no common child. This was someone raised to be noticed, to represent her people with grace. And now she was here in his cabin eating his food, while somewhere out there Chief Red Sky was likely turning the desert inside out, looking for her. The girl finished the stew and looked up at Wolf with eyes that held too much knowledge for her years. She spoke then a stream of Apache words that Wolf couldn't understand, but whose meaning seemed clear enough. "Thank you," those eyes said. "Thank you for not letting me die." Wolf found himself speaking, though he knew she couldn't understand him any better than he could her. "You're safe here, little one, for now at least. Though Lord knows what's going to come of this." He got up and found his only blanket, the wool one Sarah had woven their first winter in the territory. It still smelled faintly of her lavender soap, a scent he'd been unable to wash out, no matter how he tried. He draped it over the girl's shoulders, and she pulled it tight around herself, with a sigh that seemed to come from her very bones. Within minutes, she was asleep in the chair, her head tilted at an angle that would give her a sore neck come morning, if they both lived to see morning. Wolf stepped outside and scanned the horizon, looking for signs of pursuit. The desert stretched out empty and deceptive, hiding its secrets in the shadows of arroyos and the heat-warped distance. But he knew better than to trust that emptiness. If Red Sky's daughter had been missing for any length of time, the chief would have his best trackers scouring every water source for 50 miles, and Wolf's Creek was the only reliable water for 20 miles in any direction. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold, Wolf found himself at a crossroads he'd never expected to face. He'd been ready to die this morning, had been planning it, with the methodical care of a man who'd lost everything worth living for. But now, with an Apache chief's daughter sleeping in his cabin and the certainty of violent retribution hanging over his head like an executioner's axe. Wolf McKinnon discovered something he'd thought burned out of him forever. He wanted to live. Not for himself, he was still the same broken man who'd lost everything that mattered, but for the child sleeping in his cabin, trusting him with a faith he didn't deserve, for the chance to do right by someone who needed him, even if it meant facing down 200 Apache warriors, for the possibility of redemption even if it came at the point of a lance. The sound of approaching hoofbeats snapped Wolf from his reverie. 3 riders coming fast from the direction of town. Not Apache. Their horses' gait was all wrong, and Apache war parties didn't announce themselves with such careless noise. Wolf's hand found the grip of his Colt as he recognized the lead rider. Josiah Brennan, his nearest neighbor and the closest thing to a friend Wolf had allowed himself since Sarah's death. The other 2 were Deputy Marcus Tate and Reverend Elijah Stone. This was about to get complicated. Josiah Brennan's horse hadn't even come to a complete stop before the man was shouting, his weathered face red with a combination of hard riding and harder fear. "Sam McKinnon, you damned fool! What in the 7 hells have you gone and done?" Wolf stepped away from his cabin door, positioning himself between the riders and the entrance. His movements were casual, but his hand never strayed far from his weapon. "Afternoon to you too, Josiah. Deputy, Reverend, mighty hot for a social call." Deputy Marcus Tate dismounted with the careful movements of a lawman who'd learned caution through survival. He was young for the badge, maybe 25, but his eyes held the weight of someone who'd already seen too much of what the frontier could do to people. "This isn't a social call, McKinnon. My uncle sent word from town. Chief Red Sky's daughter went missing 4 days ago during a hunting party. Got separated in a dust storm." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire carrying the promise of devastation. Wolf kept his face carefully neutral, a skill he'd learned during the war when showing fear meant showing weakness. "That's unfortunate, but I fail to see what it has to do with me." "Don't play dumb, Sam," Josiah spat, literally spat the tobacco juice hitting the dirt near Wolf's boots. "Marcus here saw smoke signals coming from Diablo Peak this morning. The Apache are looking for something, and they're looking hard. Word is they're checking every water source between here and the Malpais." Reverend Stone hadn't dismounted yet, sitting his horse with the awkward grace of a man more comfortable with scripture than saddles. But his voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of someone used to being heard. "Brother McKinnon, we've come out of Christian concern. If you've seen anyone, it would be best to tell us now, before things escalate beyond anyone's control." Wolf studied the 3 men, weighing his options. Josiah he'd known for 2 years, a hard man but fair who'd helped him bury Sarah and William without asking for anything in return. Deputy Tate was an unknown quantity new to the badge and eager to prove himself. The Reverend, men of God, were always the wild cards in Wolf's experience. Their righteousness could cut either way. "I've been working my fence line all day," Wolf said finally. "Haven't seen anything unusual." The lie came easily, smooth as good whiskey, but even as he spoke it, he could hear sounds from inside the cabin. The girl stirring, maybe waking from her exhausted sleep. Josiah's eyes narrowed. He'd been on the frontier long enough to read the signs, the fresh sweat on Wolf's brow that had nothing to do with fence work, the way he kept his body angled to block the door, the unusual tidiness of the yard that suggested recent activity. "Sam," he said, his voice dropping low and urgent, "I'm going to ask you straight, and I need you to answer straight. Is there an Apache child in your cabin?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch out forever, broken only by the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling on the thermals. Wolf felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, heavier than the noon sun. 3 men, 3 witnesses. If he admitted to harboring Red Sky's daughter, word would spread faster than wildfire. But if he lied and they discovered it anyway? "There's a child in my cabin," Wolf said quietly, "half-starved and near dead from thirst when I found her. I did what any man with a soul would do. I gave her food and water." The explosion of voices was immediate and predictable. "God damn it, McKinnon!" Josiah roared. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You're harboring a hostile—" Deputy Tate said, his hand moving to his sidearm. "That's grounds for arrest, maybe worse." Only Reverend Stone remained silent, his lined face thoughtful as he studied Wolf with eyes that seemed to see too much. "She's a child," Wolf said, his voice carrying an edge now. 9 years old, if that. Would you have me turn out a child to die in the desert?" "That child," Josiah said, "is the daughter of a man who's killed more settlers than the pox. Red Sky finds out you've got her, he won't just kill you. He'll burn this whole valley to ash and bones." "Then he finds out," Wolf replied, "but I'll not have a child's death on my conscience. I've got enough ghosts haunting me without adding to their number." The mention of ghosts of Sarah and William seemed to take some of the wind out of Josiah's sails. He knew that particular pain, having lost his own wife to Comanche raiders 5 years back, but understanding and agreement were two different creatures entirely. Deputy Tate had drawn his weapon now, not quite pointing it at Wolf, but making its presence known. "I'm sorry, McKinnon, but I've got to take the girl. It's my duty. We return her to her people, maybe we can avoid a war." "In the dark?" Wolf asked. "She can barely stand, let alone sit a horse for hours. You take her now, she'll be dead before you make 5 miles. "That's not your concern." The deputy's words were cut off by a new sound, one that made every man freeze where he stood. War drums, distant but distinct, their rhythm carrying across the desert like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Not the chaotic beating of a raiding party, but the measured, deliberate tempo of organized force. "Sweet Jesus," Josiah whispered, "they're coming." The drums grew louder, joined by others, creating a symphony of impending violence that seemed to come from every direction at once. Wolf had heard drums like these before during the war, when the Confederates would sometimes use captured tribal warriors as scouts. The sound never meant anything good. "How many?" Reverend Stone asked, his scholarly composure finally cracking. "All of them," Wolf said quietly. "That's not a search party, that's a war party." Deputy Tate's face had gone pale beneath his tan. "We need to get back to town, warn everyone." "You'll never make it," Wolf interrupted. "Those drums are coming from the east. They've cut off the road to town." The full implications of their situation seemed to hit all 3 visitors at once. They weren't just dealing with a missing child anymore. They were standing at ground zero of what could become a massacre that would echo through the territory's history. "The girl," Reverend Stone said suddenly, "she could talk to them, explain that you helped her." "She's a child," Josiah argued. "You think Red Sky's gonna listen to a little girl when he's got blood in his eye?" But Wolf was already moving toward the cabin. "Maybe not, but it's the only chance we've got." He found Morning Star, though he didn't know her name, yet awake, and alert the sounds of the drums having roused her from sleep. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of recognition and fear that told Wolf she understood exactly what those drums meant. She spoke rapidly in Apache, pointing toward the door and then at herself, her meaning clear even across the language barrier. She knew her people were coming, and she was trying to warn him. "I know, little one," Wolf said gently. "Your father's coming for you." At the word father, one of the few Apache words Wolf had picked up from trading with peaceful bands, the girl's demeanor changed. She grabbed Wolf's shirt, pulling him down to her level, and spoke with urgent intensity. Her small hands moved in elaborate gestures, painting pictures in the air that Wolf could almost understand. She was trying to tell him something important, something about her father and the warriors who were coming. But the language barrier stood between them like a wall. and time was running out. The drums stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound could have been. It was the silence of a held breath of a bowstring, drawn to its limit of the moment before lightning splits the sky. Wolf looked out the window and saw them. They came out of the desert like ghosts given form, materializing from behind rocks and ridges where no living thing should have been able to hide. Warriors on horseback, their faces painted for war, weapons glinting in the dying light of day. They moved in perfect formation, a crescent moon of death that slowly tightened around Wolf's small ranch. He tried to count them but gave up after 50. There were at least 200, maybe more. Chief Red Sky had brought his entire fighting force. Mother of God, Deputy Tate breathed, peering through another window. We're dead men. Not yet, Wolf said, checking his weapons with movements born of long practice. But if we're going to die, we'll do it like men, not cowering in the dark. Josiah laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. 5 men against 200. Those aren't odds, Sam. That's an execution. 4 men, Reverend Stone corrected quietly. I'm a man of peace. I won't raise a weapon against my fellow man, even in defense. Then you'd better start praying, Wolf told him, because we're going to need all the divine intervention we can get. The girl tugged on Wolf's sleeve again, more insistent now. She pointed to herself, then to the door, then made a cutting motion across her throat. The message was chillingly clear. If she went out there, something bad would happen. But what choice did they have? A single voice called out from the gathering darkness, speaking in accented but clear English. White man, we know you have taken what belongs to us. Send out the girl, and perhaps you will live to see another sunrise. Wolf recognized the voice from descriptions he'd heard in town. Chief Red Sky himself, a man whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by his reputation for merciless vengeance against those who wronged his people. Well, Wolf said, looking at his uninvited guests, anybody got any bright ideas? The sound of weapons being cocked was his only answer as 200 Apache warriors waited in the darkness for a response that would determine whether the desert would run red with blood before the night was through. But it was the girl herself who would provide the answer in a way none of them expected. She stood up from the chair, the blanket falling from her shoulders, and walked to the door with the dignity of someone far older than her years. Before Wolf could stop her, she had lifted the latch and stepped outside. The night erupted in chaos. Morning Star stepped into the dying light with the composure of royalty, her small frame dwarfed by the weight of 200 pairs of eyes upon her. Wolf lunged forward to pull her back, but something in the way she moved, deliberate, purposeful, stayed his hand. This child knew exactly what she was doing. Daughter. The voice that rang out across the desert carried such a mixture of relief and rage that it made the air itself seem to vibrate. Chief Red Sky dismounted from his war pony with fluid grace, a man in his prime, despite the silver threading through his long black hair. Even in the fading light, Wolf could see the chief's face clearly, a map of battles won and losses endured, dominated by eyes that burned with an intensity that spoke of barely controlled violence. Morning Star ran to her father, calling out in Apache, her young voice carrying clearly in the desert silence. But instead of the joyful reunion Wolf expected, Red Sky's expression darkened further as he knelt beside his daughter, examining her carefully while she spoke in rapid gesturing bursts. Wolf couldn't understand the words, but he could read the body language well enough. The chief's massive frame coiled tighter. With each word, his daughter spoke like a spring being wound to its breaking point. Whatever Morning Star was telling him, it wasn't calming his rage. "McKinnon," Josiah whispered urgently from behind. "We need to fort up. Get ready for—" "No." Wolf stepped through the doorway onto his porch, hands raised but ready to go for his gun if needed. "This is my land, my situation. I'll handle it. You'll die, Deputy Tate said flatly. Maybe, but that's been the plan all along, hasn't it? Wolf moved slowly down from the porch, aware that 200 weapons were tracking his every movement. Chief Red Sky. He called out, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. Your daughter came to my land near death from thirst and hunger. I gave her food and shelter, nothing more. Red Sky rose slowly, one hand resting protectively on Morning Star's shoulder. When he spoke, his English was precise, cultured, the voice of a man who'd learned his enemy's language to better understand and defeat them. My daughter tells me you saw the sacred beads of our family. You knew who she was, yet you did not immediately return her to us. The accusation hung in the air like a blade. Wolf could feel the warriors closing in their circle, tightening imperceptibly. These weren't undisciplined raiders. They moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit. I knew, Wolf admitted, but she was too weak to travel. I was going to bring her back come morning. Perhaps, Red Sky said, taking a step forward, or perhaps you thought to trade her, to use the daughter of Red Sky as a bargaining chip for safe passage or gold. If I wanted to trade her, would I have fed her my best food, given her my only blanket? Wolf could hear the edge creeping into his own voice now. I've got no quarrel with your people, Chief. I'm just a man trying to live in peace. Peace? Red Sky spoke the word like it tasted bitter. There is no peace between our peoples. There is only the pause between wars. That's when Wolf noticed one warrior in particular, younger than the others, whose face was twisted with a grief so raw it was painful to witness. The man pushed forward through the ranks, speaking harshly in Apache, gesturing violently toward Wolf and the cabin. Red Sky held up a hand, silencing him, but the damage was done. Other warriors were nodding, muttering among themselves. The careful discipline was starting to fracture. Swift Eagle lost his brother to white soldiers 3 moons ago. Red Sky translated his voice, carrying a warning. He believes any white man who touches an Apache child must have evil intentions. He thinks I am weak for not already taking your scalp. The young warrior Swift Eagle spoke again, louder this time, and Wolf didn't need a translation to understand the challenge being thrown down. This wasn't just about Morning Star anymore. This was about leadership, about the old ways versus whatever new path Red Sky was trying to walk. Morning Star suddenly broke free from her father's grip and ran back toward Wolf, placing herself directly between him and the warriors. She spoke again, her child's voice, cutting through the growing tension with its clarity and conviction. She says you could have harmed her. Red Sky translated surprise evident in his tone. That you were alone, armed, and she was helpless. But instead you fed her, gave her your blanket, treated her with kindness. The girl continued speaking, gesturing now toward the cabin, miming, eating, and sleeping. Her story was simple but powerful in its innocence, a tale of unexpected mercy in a world that rarely showed any. But Swift Eagle wasn't convinced. He stepped forward, lance in hand, speaking directly to Morning Star now. His words were harsh, accusatory, and the girl's face crumpled as if she'd been slapped. He asks her if she has forgotten her people. Red Sky translated his voice tight with controlled anger. If one meal from a white man is enough to make her betray her own blood. That's when Morning Star did something that changed everything. She reached into her torn dress and pulled out something Wolf hadn't noticed before, a small leather-wrapped bundle. She held it up for all to see, then walked to Wolf and placed it in his hands. The weight of it was negligible, but Wolf felt it hit his palms like a stone. Through the soft deer hide he could feel the outline of what seemed to be papers or documents. Red Sky's expression shifted from anger to shock to something that might have been fear. "Where did you get that?" he demanded of his daughter. Morning Star's response was long and complex. accompanied by gestures that painted a picture Wolf was beginning to understand. She had found something hidden. It kept it safe, even through her ordeal in the desert. "Open it," Red Sky commanded Wolf. With fingers that trembled slightly, Wolf unwrapped the bundle. Inside were papers, military dispatches, by the look of them marked with official army seals. His eyes widened as he scanned the contents. "Orders," he breathed. "Military orders for—" He looked up at Red Sky. "These are plans for an attack on your winter camp. Dates, troop movements, everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "My daughter found these 3 days ago," Red Sky said slowly, "in the saddlebags of a dead army scout. She was bringing them to me when the dust storm separated her from our hunting party." "Sweet Jesus," Josiah whispered from the doorway. "Those papers could save hundreds of Apache lives." Wolf looked down at Morning Star, understanding flooding through him. She hadn't just been a lost child. She'd been a messenger carrying intelligence that could prevent a massacre, and she'd trusted him, a white man, an enemy, to do the right thing with it. "The army's planning to attack in 6 days, Wolf said, looking directly at Red Sky. "At dawn from 3 directions. They know the location of your winter stores, your horse herds, everything." Swift Eagle had gone very still, his war lance lowering slowly. The other warriors exchanged glances, the dynamic shifting palpably. This white man held their survival in his hands. "You could have kept silent," Red Sky observed. "Let the attack happen, one less Apache camp to worry about." "I could have," Wolf agreed. "But that would make me no better than the men who wrote these orders. Men who see children as acceptable casualties in their wars." He knelt down to Morning Star's level, looking into those dark eyes that had started this whole chain of events. "You're a brave girl," he told her, knowing she couldn't understand the words, but hoping she'd understand the tone. "Braver than most grown men I've known." When he stood and handed the papers to Red Sky, the chief took them with hands that Wolf noticed were trembling slightly. "You have saved my people," Red Sky said quietly. "This debt, it is not small." "There's no debt," Wolf replied. "I did what was right, same as your daughter did when she kept those papers safe." "The white man speaks truth." The voice came from behind Red Sky, an elderly warrior whose hair was completely white, his face a masterwork of lines and scars. He rode forward on a horse that seemed as ancient as he was, but his bearing was that of a man who'd earned the right to speak and be heard. "Grey Wolf," Red Sky said with evident respect, "you honor us." The elder studied Wolf with eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to the soul beneath. "I have lived through 80 winters," Grey Wolf said, his English careful but clear. "I have seen much war between our peoples, but I have rarely seen mercy." He gestured toward Morning Star. "This child was sent by the spirits to test us all. The white man passed his test. The question now is, will we pass ours?" Swift Eagle spoke up, his voice no longer angry, but troubled. Red Sky translated, "He says the others will not understand, that showing mercy to a white man will be seen as weakness." "Then they will learn," Grey Wolf replied firmly. "Strength is not only in the taking of scalps. Sometimes it is in the staying of the hand that holds the knife." Red Sky was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with competing pressures: his role as war chief, his gratitude as a father, the expectations of his warriors, and something else. Something Wolf recognized from his own struggle, the weight of choosing between what was expected and what was right. Finally, the chief spoke. "Samuel McKinnon, you have shown honor to my daughter when you had every reason to show fear or hatred. This is not a small thing." He paused, looking around at his warriors. "But honor alone cannot erase the blood between our peoples. Wolf felt his hand creeping toward his gun, sensing the shift in mood. Behind him, he could hear Josiah and Deputy Tate, preparing for the worst. However, Red Sky continued, and that single word seemed to change the very air around them. The spirits work in ways we do not always understand. My daughter carries intelligence that will save our people. She was led to you, a man with the wisdom to see beyond race to righteousness. This cannot be coincidence. Morning Star had moved to stand between her father and Wolf again, her small form a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for longer than she'd been alive. I propose this, Red Sky said formally. You will be granted safe passage through our lands. Any Apache who harms you or your property will answer to me personally. In return, you will promise that any of our people who come to you in need, whether injured, hungry, or seeking shelter, will receive the same kindness you showed my daughter. And if I refuse, Wolf asked, though he already knew his answer. Red Sky's smile was sharp as a blade. Then we will remember that you saved my daughter and gave us warning of the attack. We will give you until sunrise to leave this place. After that, he shrugged eloquently. I accept your terms, Wolf said without hesitation, but Swift Eagle stepped forward again, speaking rapidly. This time several other warriors voiced support for whatever he was saying. Red Sky's face darkened. Swift Eagle believes words are wind. He demands proof of your commitment to this peace. What kind of proof? Wolf asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. Blood proof, Grey Wolf said solemnly. The old way. You must become one of us, if only in ceremony. Share our blood, our ritual, our bond. Only then will the young warriors accept this peace. Wolf looked around at the assembled warriors, at his frightened neighbors huddled in his cabin at Morning Star, watching him with those two wise eyes. He thought of Sarah and William, of the life he'd been ready to throw away that very morning. Strange how a single act of kindness could change the course of a man's existence. I'll do it, he said. What followed was unlike anything Wolf had experienced, even in his years of war and wandering. As the sun finally disappeared behind the western mountains, turning the sky the color of blood and promises, the Apache performed a ceremony that was ancient when the first Spanish conquistadors set foot in this land. Grey Wolf produced a knife that looked older than time itself, its obsidian blade catching the firelight that the warriors had kindled. With practiced movements, he made small cuts on Red Sky's palm, then Wolf's, then pressed them together as he chanted in a language that seemed to come from the earth itself. The blood mixed Apache and white, while 200 warriors watched in absolute silence. Wolf felt something shift inside him, a connection forming that went beyond words or rational understanding. For a moment he saw the world through their eyes, the loss, the rage, the desperate fight to preserve a way of life that was being systematically destroyed. When it was over, Red Sky clasped Wolf's shoulder with his unmarked hand. You are under our protection now, but remember, this bond goes both ways. Betray it, and not even the spirits themselves will be able to save you. As the warriors began to mount their horses, preparing to leave, Morning Star ran to Wolf one last time. She hugged him around the waist, speaking words he couldn't understand, but whose meaning was crystal clear. Thank you. Then she was gone, lifted onto her father's horse, and the Apache melted back into the desert as silently as they'd come. Within minutes, it was as if they'd never been there at all, save for the mixing of blood still drying on Wolf's palm. The four men stood in the desert silence for a long moment after the Apache vanished, each processing what they'd witnessed in their own way. Deputy Tate was the first to speak, his voice shaky with released tension. Did that really just happen? Did we just watch Sam McKinnon blood bond with Apache warriors? Reverend Stone moved out onto the porch, his face thoughtful in the moonlight. I believe we witnessed something far more profound than that deputy. We saw the possibility of peace where everyone expected war. Josiah spat tobacco juice, but his usual gruffness seemed forced. Peace. That's a mighty pretty word, Sam, but you realize what you've done. Every settler in 3 counties is going to hear about this. Some will call you a traitor. Others might try to test this protection Red Sky promised. Wolf looked down at his palm where the cut was already beginning to close. The blood dried to a rusty brown. Let them talk. I've been called worse. As for testing, he shrugged. Red Sky strikes me as a man who keeps his word. The Army won't see it that way, Deputy Tate pointed out. When they find out their attack plans have been compromised, there'll be an investigation, questions about how the Apache knew. Then they'll ask their questions to the wind, Wolf replied. I didn't see any military dispatches, just fed a hungry child. The deputy studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. No, I don't suppose you did. Funny how the desert plays tricks on a man's memory. Reverend Stone clasped his hands behind his back, looking up at the stars that were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Scripture tells us that angels come in many forms. Sometimes they test us, sometimes they save us. Tonight, I think that child was both. Angel. Josiah snorted. That's one word for it. I've got others. But Wolf noticed his neighbor's tone lacked its usual venom when speaking of the Apache. The events of the night had shaken something loose in all of them, assumptions and prejudices that had seemed as solid as bedrock suddenly showing cracks. Over the following weeks, word spread through the territory like wildfire, growing and changing with each telling. Some versions had Wolf fighting off the entire Apache nation single-handed. Others claimed he'd married into the tribe and gone native. The truth, as always, was both simpler and more complex than any story could capture. The Army's planned attack never materialized. Officially, it was postponed due to logistical concerns. Unofficially, someone had warned the commanders that their target had been relocated, their advantage lost. No one asked too many questions about how this information came to light. In the territories, sometimes ignorance was the better part of survival. Wolf's Ranch became something unique in that blood-soaked landscape, a neutral ground where unspoken rules applied. Apache hunting parties would sometimes water their horses at his creek, always leaving small gifts in payment. A dressed rabbit, a pouch of tobacco, once a beautifully worked blanket that Wolf recognized as worth a small fortune. The settlers noticed, of course. Some shunned Wolf crossing the street when they saw him in town muttering about Indian lovers and worse. But others, particularly those who'd lost family to the endless cycle of raid and counter-raid, began to see possibilities they hadn't before. 3 months after that night, Josiah Brennan's nephew was caught in a flash flood while checking his trap lines. Apache warriors found him clinging to a cottonwood branch, half-drowned and delirious. Instead of taking his scalp, they remembered Red Sky's decree about the man under protection and his associates. They brought young Tom Brennan to Wolf's Ranch, where he recovered over several days, tended by Wolf and surprisingly by an Apache medicine woman who appeared without fanfare and left just as quietly when her work was done. The story of that rescue spread too, adding new layers to the legend growing around Wolf McKinnon and his strange pact with the Apache. But it was 6 months later when the true test of the bond came. Wolf was working on expanding his corral when he saw the dust cloud approaching from the south. Not the organized approach of a war party, but the desperate flight of people running from something terrible. As they drew closer, he could make out 5 Apache warriors, 3 of them clearly wounded, supporting each other on exhausted horses. They pulled up at his gate, and Wolf recognized the lead rider, despite the blood coating half his face. Swift Eagle, the young warrior, who'd wanted Wolf's scalp that night. Now he sat swaying in his saddle, a army bullet in his shoulder and desperation in his eyes. "Help," he said in broken English. "Soldiers coming." Wolf didn't hesitate. Inside quickly. He helped the wounded men into his cabin, noting with grim recognition the types of injuries they bore. These men had been ambushed, caught in the open by a cavalry patrol. The Army's new policy of aggressive defense was claiming victims on both sides. Swift Eagle grabbed Wolf's arm as he worked to stop the bleeding. "Why?" he asked. "Why, help us." "Because I gave my word," Wolf replied simply, "and because you'd do the same for a child, even one from an enemy tribe." Swift Eagle's eyes widened slightly at that, and Wolf saw understanding dawn. They worked in silence after that, cleaning wounds and setting bones with the kind of desperate efficiency that comes from necessity. The cavalry patrol arrived 2 hours later. 20 men led by a captain Wolf didn't recognize, new to the territory and eager to make his mark. Captain Harrison, according to the insignia, with the kind of fresh-faced determination that got men killed out here. "Mr. McKinnon," the captain said without preamble, "we're tracking a party of hostile Apache, 5 bucks armed and dangerous. Their trail leads directly to your property." Wolf leaned against his porch post, the picture of casual indifference. "Haven't seen any Apache, Captain. Been working my horses all day." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "You're certain these men attacked a supply wagon, killed 2 teamsters?" That was a lie, Wolf knew. Swift Eagle's wounds were defensive, not the kind you got from attacking, but he kept his face neutral. "Like I said, haven't seen anyone. Mind if we search your property?" It wasn't really a question. "Actually, I do mind," Wolf replied evenly. "This is private land, Captain. Unless you've got a warrant or evidence of a crime, I'll ask you to move along." The captain's face flushed red. "You're refusing to cooperate with the United States Army." "I'm asserting my rights as a property owner and American citizen," Wolf corrected. "Big difference." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. 20 cavalrymen with carbines versus 1 rancher with a Colt. But Wolf had learned something that night with Red Sky. Sometimes the weapon that mattered most wasn't made of steel. "I've heard about you, McKinnon," Harrison said finally. "The Indian lover, the blood traitor. You're a disgrace to your race." Wolf smiled, and there was something in that smile that made the captain's horse step nervously backward. "Captain, I've been called worse by better men. Now, unless you're planning to murder a white citizen on his own land without cause, I suggest you continue your patrol. The men you're looking for probably crossed the border into Mexico by now." Phew, for a moment, Wolf thought the young officer might actually give the order to fire, but something training politics or simple survival instinct held him back. "This isn't over," Harrison promised. "Men like you always show their true colors eventually." "Looking forward to it," Wolf replied. The patrol rode away, but Wolf knew they'd be watching. He waited until full dark, then helped Swift Eagle and his men slip away to the north toward the sanctuary of the deep canyons where cavalry couldn't follow. Before he left, Swift Eagle turned back. "The blood bond," he said in much improved English. "I did not believe. I was wrong." "We all were wrong about something," Wolf replied. "That's how we learn." Swift Eagle nodded slowly. "Red Sky says you are Bridge. I understand now. Bridge needs both sides to stand." And so it went. Month after month, year after year, Wolf's ranch remained an island of uneasy peace in a sea of conflict. Not everyone approved. He found his cattle poisoned once, his fences cut twice. But for every act of hatred, there seemed to be 2 of unexpected connection. The territorial governor eventually heard about the arrangement and rode out personally to investigate. He found Wolf teaching a mixed group of Apache and settler children how to read using a Bible and a book of Apache stories translated by a missionary. The governor left without saying much, but the harassment from official channels notably decreased after that. It was 5 years to the day after he'd found Morning Star when she returned to visit. No longer a starving child, but a young woman of 14, riding her own horse with the confidence of someone who'd found her place in the world. She spoke English now, learned from captive soldiers and trading posts. And she brought news. "My father sends greetings," she said, sitting at the same table where she'd once eaten desperately. "He says the blood bond holds strong, as it always will," Wolf replied. They talked through the afternoon, and Wolf learned that she'd become something of a bridge herself, translating for her people in negotiations, arguing for peace in councils, where war was the easier path. The intelligence she'd carried had saved her band, allowed them to negotiate from strength rather than desperation. "You saved my life," she said as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. "You saved mine," Wolf countered. "I was dying inside when you appeared. You gave me a reason to live again." Morning Star smiled, and in that smile, Wolf saw hope for a future where Apache and settler might coexist, not in perfect harmony. The blood was too bad for that, but in mutual recognition of each other's humanity. As she prepared to leave, she pulled out a small bundle. "A gift," she said, "from my father and mother." Inside was a photograph, a tintype of amazing clarity showing Red Sky, his wife, and Morning Star, all in their finest clothing. On the back, written in careful English, "For the bridge builder, may you never stand alone." Wolf placed it next to the picture of Sarah and William, two families separated by culture and conflict, but united by something deeper than blood. Morning Star visited every year after that, bringing news of her people, learning about the changing world beyond the canyons and mesas. She married a young war chief who'd learned the value of peace, had children who grew up hearing stories of the white man who'd chosen kindness over fear. And Wolf McKinnon, the man who'd been digging his own grave when fate intervened, lived to see something he'd never thought possible: Apache and settler children playing together at the annual harvest gathering he hosted their parents, watching with wary hope rather than ready weapons. He died in his sleep at the age of 73, his funeral attended by such a mixed crowd that the new minister didn't quite know what to make of it. Apache warriors stood beside cavalry veterans, their shared respect for one complicated man overcoming decades of mutual hostility. They buried him on a hill overlooking his ranch, facing east toward the sunrise. Morning Star, now a grandmother herself, spoke the final words in both Apache and English. "Here lies a man who chose to build bridges where others saw only canyons. May his spirit ride free between all worlds, forever welcome at every fire." The territorial newspapers called it the end of an era. But for those who understood what Wolf McKinnon had really accomplished, it was just the beginning. Because bridges once built with blood and honor and simple human kindness have a way of lasting longer than the wars that make them necessary. And somewhere in the space between peoples, where understanding grows like desert flowers after rain, the spirit of a lonely rancher and a starving child continued to prove that the greatest courage isn't in winning battles, it's in preventing them.